Hello and welcome to Pedagogically Speaking. My name is Ilana Huffer, and I'm very excited to start my podcast. This all stemmed from honestly just being a teacher. I've been teaching, I'm in my 16th year of teaching, and I started my master's program 3 years ago. I've just completed it, so I'm very excited. And I had to take a little break because I ended up needing surgery on my knee. So I had meniscus. They were supposed to stitch up my meniscus, but they ended up shaving it, and then I had my ACL restructured as well. Uh, so just to get a little personal right off the bat. So then, yes, I needed to take some time off for that, and I've just finished 2 courses, so I'm really excited for that. And I decided that I really wanted to share my knowledge and start this podcast, so I'm very excited for that. So welcome to my podcast, and I'm calling this episode Reimagining Assessment. So we'll be exploring how teachers can transform assessment from something that measures learning into something that actually creates it. By the end of this episode, you will understand why assessment needs to be reimagined. We'll talk about the key theoretical frameworks that shape how we assess learning, and also how to use culturally responsive and ethical informative approaches to assessment. I'm going to sprinkle in some practical strategies to collaborate and to apply assessment data to support all of your students and all their unique learning needs. So I'm Ilana Huffer. I'm an inclusive education teacher in British Columbia and a lifelong learner, as I'm sure you all are. And I've been really into learning about assessment recently, and also I think for a long time as an inclusive education teacher doing level B assessments. So assessments really have always intrigued me, I think because so many educators assess differently and look at assessments in different ways. And I've noticed this both as an inclusive learning teacher and as a mom and as a classroom teacher. I did start off my career as a teacher in the classroom. I was a kindergarten teacher and then a grade 3-4 teacher. Then I dabbled a little bit in as a teacher librarian, and then I've come all the way to inclusive learning, which I'm very excited about. And as an inclusive learning teacher, I have helped other teachers interpret and act on their assessment data, um, IEPs, level B tools, so also classroom-based observations and student self-assessments. And I do think that effective assessments require teachers to think really carefully about the goal of their assessment and also adjust what students need around it. So over time, I did begin to notice something. Um, Assessments, though one of the most powerful tools we have, is also one of the most misunderstood tools. Too often, assessment is treated as the finish line. It's a score, it's a report, it's a label. You finished unit, so now here's the assessment. But I really do think, what if assessment could instead be the conversation that moves learning forwards? So that's what this episode is all about. Ambitious though it is. Reimagining assessment and data collection through culturally responsive and formative practices for inclusive classrooms. So, why should we reimagine assessment? We're going to focus on the limitations of traditional assessments and the potential harms of teaching to the test, as well as opportunities for growth. So I think that large-scale, high-stakes assessments can have a negative reaction by people. They have been historically, and also even to this day, misused. So such as, using large-scale assessment data to label for remedial programs or to evaluate teacher effectiveness, or even having high-stakes assessments and not giving the data back to the schools once you've taken the data out of the assessments, not giving it back to the schools so that they can improve practices or strengthen um, team lead, understanding of assessments, or even to potentially, ask for more funding to help with resources to help students. So, which I think is an ethical consideration when we're having large scale assessments, standardized assessments given to students, and we're not using that information to actually benefit the students. And I just think, what are those ethical considerations? What do you think about that? What would you think about finding out that the standardized tests that are administered to the students in your classroom, and all of the anxiety and different things that it affects, and then not having the data from that assessment to support learning? What are your thoughts on that? So, um, yeah, I think high stakes assessments, large scale assessments do continue to be used to rank schools as well. And we know that from the Fraser Institute. But really, assessment shapes everything in education. It shapes what we teach, it shapes how students learn, and even how resources are distributed. Yet, there are so many teachers, especially those working in an inclusive or culturally diverse context, who express uncertainty about how to make assessment meaningful in their classrooms. So, when I started diving into the work of Laurie A. Shepard and her article, The Role of Assessment in a Learning Culture, it was like she'd put words to all the frustrations that I had been feeling for years. And sometimes I think also when you are in an education role, like when you're a teacher, yes, we are constantly in a community. We have our classroom community, and then maybe we're working with teachers um, in a team, or just the people that are around you in the hallway. And then, of course, we do have administrators and parents. But I think sometimes it still is, at least to me, quite a lonely profession, especially as more and more funding kind of gets stripped away. We don't have that time to collaborate during the school day. Um, Everyone is just so burnt out and exhausted. And so you can just feel so isolated and then think, is this just a me problem? Is this just something that I'm seeing? So I really did love reading that article and how Shepard critiques the dominance of behaviorist thinking in schools, which is this idea that assessment is about correction and compliance instead of, assessment as growth and understanding. And so Shepard argues that we need to shift to a constructivist model, one where assessment is embedded in instruction and where feedback is a dialogue, a conversation, and learning is dynamic and ongoing, not ongoing, ongoing. And shows that hundreds of studies on feedback have reinforced quite narrow ideas about teaching, and missing the deeper purpose of formative assessment, which is to scaffold reflection and growth. So that really resonated with me, because when assessment becomes a dialogue, it stops being something that is done to students and becomes something that's done with them, alongside them. And Black and William also state that formative assessments must give students feedback so that it can be used by the students to improve their learning. Because formative assessment absolutely leads to significant learning gains. And it's funny, this actually reminds me of the time I was working with a teacher who did the same reading comprehension test every term, for years. Of course, we find something that works and we want to keep using it. And then all of a sudden she had this class where she was sure the students understood more than what their assessments were coming back with. And so she was thinking and thinking. We talked about it. We talked about what she thought her students were capable of. And we also discussed the challenges that her current assessment was bringing. We also talked about, was it noisy in the classroom? Did the students need visuals or different tools to understand what the questions were, and not just listen to her voice asking the question? And so after we talked, she reimagined her traditional reading comprehension test. And instead of asking students to answer multiple choice questions, she invited them to choose how to show their understanding. So through drawing, with a voice recording, or writing. And the result was that the students who usually struggled with written tests were able to express deep, deep comprehension in new ways. And this small redesign really turned the assessment into a tool for learning and inclusion, not just evaluation. And I think another really interesting way to do reading comprehension as well for students who maybe use AAC, like assistive technology, to communicate is, we really want to understand that literacy is for everyone, and we really want to take away those barriers to literacy. And so we do want to assess all of our students with literacy to gain understanding of honestly what they understand. And so I have a student who uses AAC, and just being able to, read a book with them, have them read a book to me, and then ask for comprehension, is the bear, and giving 3 choices, is the bear happy, angry, or sad? And then just always mixing up where the right answer is. This is another way to check for comprehension for reading in a different way, but in a way that takes away barriers from students in order for them to access the literacy, and in order for you to really understand, their level of comprehension, which is really important. And so just that key takeaway of reimagining assessment shifts the focus from labeling students to understanding their learning and to guide your own instruction. So I think that's just very important. Um, and as I said, I am a teacher in British Columbia. And when you're in Canada, we do know that each province has different policies and frameworks for education and teaching, which then gets interpreted by school districts, which is always fun. I think sometimes as teachers, we will get a ministry directive and understand it one way, but then the directive from our school district, is a little bit different. And obviously, I do think school districts should use teachers' professional judgments, and that is supported by research by DeLuca et al. And here in British Columbia, the Ministry of Education and Childcare emphasizes personalized learning. They emphasize inclusion and competency-based assessments, which on paper is very, very powerful. But I wonder, how is it in practice? How is it for teachers um, who may still be struggling to bridge the gap between policy and pedagogy? I often hear questions from colleagues that are, such as, how do I balance the paperwork, for the IEPs, with the actual learning that's happening? Or one that I hear quite often is, if a student doesn't have an individualized education plan, can I still adapt my assessments for them? And, the answer is absolutely, please adapt those assessments, please adapt, you know, um, assignments and workload. We really do want to take the barriers away from students so that they can access learning at multiple different points. Um, and the best way to do that, the best way to have all students access learning, is to provide differentiated instruction, and, understanding universal design for learning is really important. And I do understand, like, the tensions are absolutely real. You know, uh, we have teachers who are just so overwhelmed, and so there's just so much put on them, and there's not enough time, and there's not enough prep time, there's no collaborative time. Or if you do have collaboration time, please let me know how much you got and how you use it, because I'm super interested. We do have our Education Services Manual from 2023 that does give clear guidance on process and compliance, but not a lot of guidance on how to interpret assessment through a culturally responsive lens, or even how to use that data to drive daily instruction. And so, that's what this podcast and my capstone project which is to contribute to bridging that gap. I really do want to bring theory to life, to connect policy to practice and start conversations that can help move assessment beyond measurement and move it into meaning making. So just a key takeaway that, context really does matter, and assessment is most meaningful when it reflects local learning goals and when it considers the diversity of students in your classrooms and in the BC classroom context. So thank you. All right, so let's talk about theory. So the theoretical frameworks: behaviorism versus constructivism, which is really just comparing traditional rote-based assessments with constructivist, student-centered approaches. And so let's unpack that theory a little bit. So the behaviorist model sees learning as observable and very measurable, and really is that linear thinking, like you're here, then you go here, then you go there. But it really does just turn into assessment in that framework, in that theory, really just becomes about scores, comparisons, and performance. And it certainly can be efficient, but it really does miss the heart of learning, the thinking, reflecting, and meaning making that students do. So the constructivist model views assessments as part of the learning process. So scholars like Black and William, and Stiggins, they remind us that formative assessment, which is honestly, it is what you are doing in class every day. It's the kind of assessment that happens every day in classrooms. Exit tickets, checking, raising your hands. What do we understand? It has one of the greatest impacts on student achievements. And when teachers use assessment as part of instruction rather than after instruction, they're really gaining insight into how their students are understanding what they're learning. That way, teachers can adjust their teaching accordingly. Um, which brings me to a new voice in my own learning, actually, Thomas Guskey, and his 2003 article, when he says, teachers who develop useful assessments, who provide corrective instruction, and give students second chances to demonstrate success, those are the teachers that can improve their instruction and help students learn. And did that quote stop me in my tracks? And that's because it really did just confirm something that I have been doing since my first practicum, which is letting students resubmit work, offering descriptive feedback on their process, and treating mistakes as opportunities for learning. And teachers are really working towards having their students know that mistakes are a part of learning and that everyone makes these mistakes, and modeling, that modeling process of like, oh, I think I've made a mistake, I'm going to correct it now, and really showing that everyone does make mistakes. If I'm letting my students resubmit work, I can't just give them the same grade that I've given the students who didn't need to resubmit their work, who just got it the first time. And, there is this analogy that I absolutely love and use a lot. It's I've got it from one of the readings that I've done. It's not my own analogy, but it likens learning and letting students resubmit work as your driver's license. So many people do not get their driver's license on the first go. I'm lucky I did, but most of my friends and family did not. And however, when they redid their test, they got the exact same license that I got. They didn't get a lesser license. They didn't have any restrictions on their license that I didn't have. We all just got our full licenses, whether you were able to pass the first time or not. And I think that just really shows you how it can just take anyone. Different people will do differently on tests, and it's okay to give them another go, to give them another opportunity to access learning, because we want to take barriers away from learning. We don't want to uphold them. And we really want students to turn into lifelong learners and to understand that learning is a continuous process in life. And I think modeling mistakes is one thing, but also modeling or just showing an understanding that it takes different people, different ways to be successful in learning, whatever that looks like, I think is really powerful and a very powerful tool to use with students and for students, okay? Because treating mistakes, because we want to offer, descriptive feedback on the student's learning process. And we really do want to treat mistakes as opportunities. We also really want to know where the students are at, because we don't want to charge ahead with our lessons or our units when the students haven't fully learned something, right? Because that would be quite foolish. So Gusky does remind us that assessment isn't the end. It's the moment to pause. We want to pause, we want to reteach, and we want to re-engage with students. So the key takeaway is that constructivist assessment approaches prioritize understanding, reflection, and student agency over just the simple right or wrong answers. So think about your own classroom. How often do you move on after a test, even when you know that some students didn't get it? And then what if we reframed those results not as final judgments, but as diagnostics for what comes next? All right, so I would love to dive into culturally responsive and ethical assessment. So the importance of inclusion, the ethical use of data, and multiple means of demonstrating learning. Also, how can we avoid bias, right? We can't talk about assessments without talking about equity. And researchers like Julian and Klinovsky and McDonald, they've shown us how traditional assessments, often designed through Western colonial frameworks, can really misrepresent Indigenous learners' strengths. So, culturally responsive assessment asks us to recognize that there are many ways of knowing and holding knowledge in our bodies and showing our knowledge and learning. And it really is just about honoring relational accountability and valuing story and oral knowledge and also the community context. So, as Klinovsky in 2009 points out, Quiddian assessment means co-constructing the criteria, not imposing it. When students and communities help define what success looks like, then assessment becomes more authentic and much more inclusive. And I do understand that that can really scare some teachers who've been doing the same thing for years. Um, and with everything going on, change can be really hard. But we need to continue moving forward in education. And that really means collaborating, and not just collaborating with teachers, but we want to bring in collaborators, bring in people from the communities that we are working with to help us understand how we can assess students in a way that centers them and their lived experiences. I remember my first practicum back in 2009 in Australia. No, I don't want to. This centers them and their lived experiences. We want to be making sure that our assessments are not bringing in something that is insignificant. We want to center it around students and also place and space. And I think that's really important. So if you are, doing dibbles or something and the text is about hurricanes and you don't live, or where you are teaching or doing the assessment doesn't have hurricanes, I don't think it's a very fair assessment. And I don't actually think it's ethical, because what if you've never seen, learned about, read about, seen a movie about a hurricane, had any kind of exposure to hurricanes? How are you going to have any connection to the text? And how is that really going to assess anything that you know? And so I think it's really important. We do all know to have texts in our classrooms, books in our classrooms and books in our school libraries that show full representation of students, and that looks like different, books on neurodivergence, books on LGBTQ2S, LGBTQIA plus people and rights, and books by Indigenous authors and illustrators, as well as different cultures and that have different people of color in them, that are written by people of color and illustrated by people of color. And that is very important to also then have your assessments reflect that. And one of the ways that you can ensure that your assessments do reflect that is by co-constructing those assessments with your students. And I know that's really hard. It can be hard. And it can be, quite frankly, a surprise, because I remember in my practicum back in 2009, or I was in Australia at the time, and I was teaching a grade 10 socials unit. And my mentor teacher asked me, after I'd put the unit together, so where's your rubric? And I had no idea what she was talking about. And I was like, oh, what is a rubric? And she told me that it was essentially how students knew what the marking criteria was, so that they were in charge of their learning, and the marking would be transparent, so they would know what I was looking for and how that they could get the best grade that they wanted or that they could. And I am not going to lie, but I was like, that is cheating. That is cheating. And of course, now I know that it's not cheating. We don't want to trick kids. We want them to know what they will be evaluated on, so that they have the power to choose how to approach their projects or the assignments. But as a child growing up in the 80s, I never knew. And it caused me so much anxiety. If I'm being honest, it really made me hate school. I am not one of those teachers that got into teaching because I loved my teachers and I loved school. And, I wanted to, that's not why I got into teaching. I got into teaching, honestly, because I was like, there has got to be a better way to do this. So I was actually quite happy in 2009, after the initial shock of that, to realize that schooling has changed. Education had changed. Even though I did go to school in Toronto, I was in the Toronto District School Board school. I went to Lord Lansdowne because I grew up in downtown Toronto. But yeah, not knowing how the teachers were assessing me made me hate school, because I would think I did such a good job and I'd get my papers back, and it was always like a lower mark than I had thought. And I didn't understand. I did not understand. And I was not, and I still am not, a person who could read minds, and a kid who knew how to read their teacher's mind, or knew just instinctively what they were looking for in a test or an assignment. And so I do wonder if in the 80s, if this co-constructing of assessments and transparency of evaluation were present back then, would I have had, like, maybe not an easier time, but just a better in general time at school? So, and that does extend beyond Indigenous education, and it does apply to all learners whose experiences, whose culture, whose languages, whose neurodiversities are not fully captured by a standardized test. So, key takeaway here is that assessment should really reflect students' cultural, linguistic, and individual differences to really be considered fair and, I would say, valid. Um, so yeah, the role of data, you know, formative, not just formal. And so I would love to talk about data, even though it is certainly a word that makes so many teachers sigh, especially this time of the year when it's report cards. Everyone's stressed out, but data is not the enemy. The problem is when that data becomes detached from meaning. Classroom assessments, when they are purposeful, they give us an instant feedback on what students are learning day to day. You're teaching up there at the whiteboard or your smart board. I don't know where you're teaching. I have a whiteboard. And you're teaching this lesson and you are asking, you're constantly asking questions. What's going on? You are getting that feedback loop immediately. And I know you're doing that multiple times a day for different lessons in different subject areas. And you're doing that day to day. So, that's the formative assessment that is really guiding your instruction. If those students are getting it or if they need more help. Are you going to bring in tactile parts of a lesson to help them really fully grasp something? Are you going to do more storytelling? Are you going to have students break into pairs, think, pair, share, or break into small groups and talk about what they've learned and how it, ties to their life? Making those connections, right, to themselves or a text or to their world. And so it is that understanding of how students are learning day to day. And that does help us adjust our teaching in real time. And this ongoing data collection really does allow us to notice trends within our classrooms. It allows us to track growth and really lets us see students as evolving learners instead of static numbers. But, there are certainly risks to formative assessment like this because, different teachers interpret the same data in different ways. And I do understand that, standardized assessments can help with that consistency, but it really does strip away the nuance of learning and understanding. And then there's also the reality that resources are not equal across schools, especially now in so many school contexts, at least in British Columbia, where there are no more textbooks. And even if you do have textbooks from before, districts stopped, um, sort of kind of giving textbooks to teachers, they're old now and they have not been updated. And so not only are the resources that schools have different, do you have colored printing or do you not have access to colored printing? Do you have a laminator? Do you have, there's just so many different types of resources that different schools in a school district will have, let alone the resources that teachers can afford to have in their classroom to make a more enriched learning community or make more enriched learning opportunities possible in their classrooms. And so, teachers can definitely identify a need in the classroom, but they're going to lack that support or personnel in order to respond. Maybe you don't have an EA, but you recognize that you need one. We really do have to hold both of those truths that classroom-based data are rich and responsive, but they require collaboration and reflection. They require equity-minded interpretation. So yeah, I really think formative data does inform instruction and it supports growth and provides actionable insight, unlike high stakes scores alone. But we need the funding to back up all of what that data tells us. So high stakes versus formative assessments. Can high stakes assessments be used formatively? So what are your thoughts? Can standardized assessments, can that data be used as we would use formative assessments? I will give you my answer right now, so you can pause it if you want to think about it, but I don't think it can at all. Not really, because the timing alone makes it difficult. let alone the fact that standardized tests, depending on what tests you're doing, maybe let me know which standardized tests you do in your area, but it can take weeks because it can take, if you do language arts 3 times a week for 30 minutes, which I know you're doing more, but let's say you've dedicated that time to the standardized tests. What if not everyone's there? And, what if there's a fire alarm or a lockdown? Something else happens, there's an assembly, it can end up taking just weeks to do it. Students aren't there, then you're sending that student. Here's the thing, even if it doesn't take all of your students 6 30-minute blocks to complete it, you're going to have students that are away. And then they're going to be, maybe they're doing that test with another teacher, or they're going out with an EA. There's different ways that you're going to get those students to do that assessment, but you cannot teach without your students in the classroom, and you can't move on. And so you're in this space where you're doing whatever you're doing with your classroom, but it is still taking up time. Like, it is still taking up quite a big amount of time. And then also, it's the time where the assessment is done, and then it goes off to go and get assessed, right? Like, where people are getting the data out of the assessment. And that takes time. So by the time you get that, the results come back, the students have moved on. And so you're not exactly using it to support your learning. And you can use those results as a reference, like a snapshot, but really it should never replace ongoing formative practices, right? So like, when schools or districts are relying solely on high stakes data, teaching really does narrow, and we start teaching the tests, and some students can thrive in that environment, but so many students lose confidence and lose their motivation because their learning becomes something that's more akin to survival and not discovery or curiosity. And so, yes, the big assessments can be used for system level insight if they're being used for that at all, because if the school districts have all that information, are they using that to support schools with more funding or more resources? I don't know. But hopefully that is what they're doing. And hopefully it's not just to rank schools. But we do really want to keep the heart of formative work alive in your classroom every day, right? So the key takeaway is that high stakes results, really, they tell only a part of the story. And ongoing formative assessment gives teachers and students the information that they can act on immediately. So reflection, collaboration, and professional judgment. How teachers can work together to interpret data, validate results, and make professional judgments. So a key takeaway is that high stakes results, it tells only part of the story, and formative assessment gives teachers and students the information they can act on immediately. How can teachers work together to interpret data, validate results, and make professional judgments, especially nowadays when we just don't have the time, when our collaboration time has taken away from us and we've got too much to do? I think really it is just about finding that time to work together, because at the end of the day, assessment literacy is really about professional judgment. And I mean that as the art and science of knowing when and how to use the evidence that we're collecting, all that data. So as Klinger et al. Reminds us in 2015, ethical assessment demands fairness, validity, and reliability, but it also demands reflection, and when we collaborate, when we're talking to our colleagues, when teachers, learning support staff, and administrators can come together to interpret data together, I said together 20 times, we strengthen not only our understanding, but our shared responsibility for student growth. And I think this is really where mentorship and dialogue become essential. In my own practice, I've seen the power of collaborative conversations where teachers are able to unpack assessment results together, asking, what patterns are we seeing? What might this tell us about our teaching? And what can we try next? And those powerful moments are where growth really happens for both students and educators. So the key takeaway there really is that collaborative reflection and professional judgment strengthens both the reliability and validity of assessment decisions. So really, the whole takeaway, what I really want for this podcast is that we're looking at assessment as an ongoing dialogue between teachers with students, and honestly, an ongoing dialogue with the data. So as I bring this episode to a close, I really want to leave you with this thought. Assessment, it's not a number, it's a narrative. It's a story of where a student has been, where they are now, and where they might go next. We will know that if we're listening carefully enough. So Shepard called on us to build a learning culture. Ski reminded us that assessment should guide instruction, not end it. And the teachers and educators that I work with every day remind me that this work is deeply human. It's complex, it is imperfect, and it is transformative. So maybe it's time we stop seeing assessment as the end of learning and start seeing it as the heart of learning. Thank you for listening to Reimagining Assessment. I'm Ilana Huffer. This is Pedagogically Speaking, and I hope this episode inspires you to look at your own classroom practices and see assessment as more than measurement, but as meaning. Thank you so much.